I'm joined by lead sponsor and vice chair of this order, City Councilor Anissa Asabi George. I want to remind you that this is a public hearing. It's being recorded and will be broadcast on Comcast Channel 8, RCN Channel 82, Verizon 1964, and online. Please silence your cell phones and other devices. We will also take public testimony, and I would appreciate it if you would sign in and be sure to check off the box to testify. Please state your name, affiliation, residence, and limit your comments to a few minutes to ensure that all comments and concerns can be heard. Today's hearing is on docket number 0196, order for a hearing regarding the regulations and enforcement of the residency policy for Boston Schools Department. I would like to thank Monica Roberts, Assistant Superintendent of Engagement for the Boston Public Schools, and Carolyn McNeil, Ombudsperson for the Boston Public Schools, for joining us this morning. Councilor Asabi George.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for hosting this meeting this morning, and thank you both for being here today. I am really excited to get back to this residency hearing and to talk about student residency in the Boston Public Schools. As you would recall, we had a hearing over a year ago talking about residency in the city of Boston as it pertains to our schools and the work that had happened to date. And the purpose of today's hearing is to understand the changes that have happened over the course of the last school year, and then leading into the current school year, and to understand how the policy has been updated and improved. It's my understanding that there have been some significant improvements, and as a result of those improvements, there have been a number of cases, or an additional number of cases that have come forward. For me, residency, or the skirting of the residency requirement in our Boston Public Schools is really a theft of services. It is certainly not a problem I have with our children, our students that attend our schools. It's a problem of parents choosing to skirt the system and to falsify residency documents or to move during a student's time in our schools and not update their records with Boston Public Schools. So I'm excited to learn about all that's happened over the course of the last 18 months or so, and understand how we can do more to improve the process, both to protect our seats for our students and to make sure that those that are skirting the system and stealing services and seats from our kids are held accountable and billed accordingly. So thank you, Chair, for that, and I look forward to hearing the testimony today.
Thank you very much. I think in addition to our lead sponsor's comments, I think it's also important to understand that the city of Boston is a high-cost area and that people are being displaced every single day. My office, on a weekly basis, attends to 50, 60 families that are being displaced and having to move. And so I would really also like to hear any connection that the Boston Public Schools Department of Neighborhood Development and others are making around these areas and issues. And we know that an individual is defined as homeless. Actually, I think the other component is that the definition and requirements to be considered homeless in the state of Massachusetts have changed in the past couple of years. The requirement now, if you were to say that you were sleeping on the couch of a family member, then you are actually in this state not considered homeless, which is really problematic. And so I guess with the issues, $2,200 a month one-bedroom apartments, which is the average in the city of Boston, and knowing that your student population is many of the students and families would have been defined in the old free and reduced lunch pool, and they're poor. What is happening in that space? And I think that's a complicating factor when it comes to these issues. So we look forward to your testimony. Monica, Carolyn, whoever is going to start. Yep.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Jackson and Councilor Asabi George, for having us here today. For the record, my name is Monica Roberts. I am the Assistant Superintendent of the Office of Engagement. And I'm here with my colleague, Carolyn McNeil, who is our ombudsperson for the Boston Public Schools. I will start with just a kind of an overview of the residency verification process as it starts from the beginning when families are coming into the system. Carolyn will talk about some of what we've been doing on the investigatory front and the progress that we've made. The Boston Public Schools requires registered students to be Boston residents. Residency is defined as the place where a person dwells permanently, not temporarily, and is the place that is the center of his or her domestic, social, and civic life. When registering for school for the first time, families must produce 2 proofs of residency. Residency verification is not required again after initial entry at this time. BPS employs 1 residency investigator who reports to the ombudsperson to address suspected violations of this policy reported through the Residency Fraud Hotline. It's important to note that these requirements do not apply to individuals and families who are identified as homeless. Welcome Services and the ombudsperson are currently developing guidance for school staff, including teachers, outlining potential signs that a student may not live in a city and steps to be taken when this is suspected. Given the distance many of our students travel to school and other family and neighborhood factors, BPS is addressing this cautiously. We do not want schools to over-identify families from historically marginalized populations who may be experiencing life challenges that result in behaviors that raise inaccurate suspicions of non-residency. Examples include persistent tardiness, late drop-off or pickup for walkers, and students self-reporting moving to another city or town, all of which could be indicators of homelessness as well. Families can, but are not required to, report their homeless status to their child's school, and so we're also working on how we improve that sort of communication through the school and back to the district. It is worth noting that families who want to cheat the system can often find ways to produce the required documentation to circumvent the rules. This includes renting or owning a Boston-based residence while living elsewhere, or having friends and family who allow use of their address. It is difficult to detect and confirm such cases, which is why we have the investigation officer. With these challenges in mind, the Boston Public Schools has an internal team working on 3 potential options on how we might really proactively get at the residency issue. And part of what we're looking at is the feasibility, because some of them might require negotiations with different union bodies, as well as the equity impact and making sure that we are not negatively impacting families who are already experiencing challenges. So we are going through our planning and vetting process. We hope to start gathering community and family input in the spring. Obviously, we want to also hear from the Boston City Council members as to their thoughts on some of the options that we are hoping to propose. I think most critically is, as in the current climate that we're in, we have been thinking about this issue of equity. We know that for many of our families, a lot of our families each year are entering into the state and into the country very recently, and quite frankly, producing the residency requirements is challenging if you are new to the city, new to the state. And so these are some of the factors that we're looking at as we are looking through our options. And with that, I'll turn it over to Carolyn.
Thanks. Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to testify on behalf of the Boston Public Schools regulation and enforcement of the BPS residency policy. This is a very important issue, and we are pleased that you are convening another discussion on this topic. My name is Carolyn McNeil, the ombudsperson for the Boston Public School District. I serve as an objective and neutral party tasked with listening and investigating complaints within the Boston Public School system. The ombudsperson is a central point of contact and resource for parents and other members of the community who have concerns related to our schools in the district. I represent the superintendent's office, and part of my related duties is overseeing the residency investigations for the district. Mayor Walsh, along with Superintendent Chang, are working together to create a more equitable, coherent, and innovative school system. They greatly value city residents having full access to our public schools, and a strong residency policy and the rigorous enforcement supports these values. As the state continues to provide less and less reimbursement to school districts, it is important that Boston Public School seats are filled with our residents. In determining residency, BPS reserves the right to request a variety of documentation and to conduct an investigation into where a student actually resides. Because residency can and often does change for students and their families during the course of the academic year, BPS may continue to verify residency after the commencement of classes. Also, Boston Public Schools may act upon anonymous tips we receive to conduct a residency verification investigation. We are particularly sensitive to the needs of our families from historically marginalized populations who may be experiencing life challenges that result in behaviors that raise inaccurate suspicion. The Boston Public School District receives information of residency violations from a variety of sources, including our anonymous tip line, teachers and school administrators, families, students, and community residents. All tips and information are followed up on and vigorously investigated. Our residency policy, which was revised in September 2013 to include eligible students applying to exam schools, states that in order to attend a Boston public school, a student must actually reside in the city of Boston. The residence of a minor child is presumed to be the legal primary residence of the parents or guardian who have physical custody of the child. Residency is defined as the place where a person dwells permanently, not temporarily, and is the place that is the center of his or her domestic, social, and civic life. Our policy is outlined in detail on our website. It is distributed to families through our Family and Student Handbook, and annually to every student and family that attends school. So, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Councilor Salvi George?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both again for your opening comments. Carolyn or Monica, would you walk me through the process of confirming a student's residency? So I'm applying to Boston Public Schools, or I'm applying to take one of the exams. It doesn't matter which one. I'm just sort of curious about the documents that are required and all of that.
So we have, so we ask families to bring in 2 of 6 proofs of residency. So usually it's a utility bill. We can't use things like mobile phones, a lease, or a statement of affidavit from a landlord or whoever you're staying with. So there are about 6 documents that families can bring in. They have to physically bring them in. They have to be within, I believe, the last 60 days, which is why it presents a challenge for our families who are recently relocating to the city. And so our team checks them against their identification and makes copies, and those go on record as part of their registration process. For the exam schools, it's a similar process, except for you're coming in just for to take the test. So then we are issuing you proof or a certificate that you have come and verified residency. You have to have that in hand in order to sit for the BPS administration of the ISEE.
And then could you walk me through the process of reviewing a tip? So a phone call or an email or a letter comes in noting that a student, suspicious of not living in the city. What's the process of reviewing that tip and or that complaint?
So generally speaking, we'll get information, whether it's an email or a tip, through a phone call, and the residency investigator will follow up with the person who calls. And generally speaking, I would say we don't get an awful lot of anonymous. It's, for the most part, it's either a teacher, principal, administrator, more likely than not. The residency investigator follows up, asks for as much information as possible, and then, again, based on the information, we'll do a series of observations. We utilize the RMV records. We go to land court. We do property searches. A number of different avenues to vet out the information that we receive. We have probably within the last year started working with the assessing office, the assessor's office, and inspectional services. So that's netted us some really, really good information. And so we work closely with them. And so I think for the most part, a lot of it is observational. and, you know, information that we find from other outlets.
And then we have, how many investigators?
One full-time.
One full-time. And is that comparable to other districts?
It's been my experience in searching that no, that generally speaking, other districts have greater numbers of staff.
Right, and I know I've reached out to the school district in Revere, and I think for their 7,000 students or so, this was a little bit ago, so my memory might fail me, but in Revere, they have something like 7,000 students that attend their schools. We have 57,000, and they have 2 or 3 investigators. And then, you know, similar case in Milton. And those 2 districts, on occasion, or probably more than just on occasion, have students that are Boston residents attending their schools. And so there's this back and forth that happens with outside districts, but Milton and Revere, for example, have much smaller student populations, but seem to have a larger number of investigators.
And I tend to work closely with the surrounding towns, so.
Are there any other, I don't know if, you don't have an idea, though, of some of the other districts. Those I just happen to know
Brookline.
offhand.
Brookline has-
How many
Brookline has
students
2.
and how many investigators?
I don't know the number of students.
Yep.
But I know that they have 2.
They have 2 investigators. And it's certainly fewer students than we have in the city of Boston. Can you talk about the last time that the last time the residency policy was updated was in 2013? And are there any efforts to update it? You know, that's 4+ years ago now. Are there any efforts to update it?
So I think as we go through this process of thinking about how we might shift the front end of residency requirements, that will feed into any shifts into the policy that are needed to make that happen.
Right. And then, can you speak to the number of discharges that have happened over the last few school years?
Sure. So I have numbers from the last academic year and year-to-date information. So last year, there were 108 residency cases brought to our attention.
So that's for school year 16, 17.
16, 17, yes.
108 cases, okay?
So 43 cases resulted in discharges due to non-residency. 37 cases were resolved with students being residents of Boston. 4 cases were investigated with special placements. 2 investigated.
What does that mean with special
So-
placements?
They were tuition cases. In other words, they were out of district, and they were out of district placements. So 2 were investigated, were homeless and allowed to stay, and 22 cases went unresolved. Now, I want to sort of clarify the 22 cases that went unresolved. We get a lot of tips and a lot of information or suspicion of families that aren't residents, but we need a physical address. So it's not enough to say, you know, a student said that they're living in Brockton, or they're tired because they have a long car ride. We need a physical address. And oftentimes that becomes challenging. We do not follow cars, you know, the investigator will, if they have a suspicion that a family is coming from out of the district, there are occasions where he will look and wait for a car and get a license plate registration and run the plate. But it becomes tricky. We need sometimes more information than we get.
So let me just jump in for a sec. The physical address you're talking about is an alternative physical address,
Alternative.
right? So you're saying that you have to be able to say that they don't live in Boston, but they live in Brockton.
So it's an observation.
Okay.
It becomes a matter of an observation. So we'll observe and investigate the residents on file. But we also, if we don't see a family or students coming out of that residence, And we don't have any alternative address. We're sort of at a loss.
Counselor?
Can you tell me about the, and then the year before, school year 15-16? If I remember correctly, there were 22 discharges for school year 15-16.
I don't have
Okay,
those
I'm
numbers
going
in
to double
front
check
of
my
me.
notes. I was
Okay,
looking for
okay.
that quickly earlier, but I believe that's the number. So we do have, significantly more, almost doubled if 43 are discharged. Tell me about the 4 that investigated with special placement. So it's out of district. So those are students that live outside the district and are paying to attend our school?
No. We do not allow that in the city of Boston. Those were, so students that we place for disabilities, generally speaking, so they go to our school and have found that because of their disability, we can't meet their needs, so they're going to a school outside of.
Yep. But then they've since moved out of the city, but we're still paying for them?
Not necessarily, no.
So why, I don't
No.
understand why they would be investigated if they were attending school outside of the district.
Because we got information to suggest, it's just information that we follow up on.
Okay. So it could be possible that we're paying for students to get out-of-district placement because we're not meeting their needs in the city. And it could be for special needs, it could be for vocational ed. And while we're paying for them to attend this other school, they could move out of the city and we don't have that updated information and we're continuing to pay for them.
So there was, I know that there was this one particular case comes to mind, and there were 2 siblings. They were found to live in Burlington, and you might know the particulars of this, but if we get information to suggest that they are not living through April, we have to, it has to do with special ed placements. And if we get information before May, we are on, and this is any district is on the hook for the following year. So we have to get that information before May. Do you know the particulars of that, or? I don't. Yeah, I can get back to you on that.
I'm interested in that. So what are the students, though, that we would pay to go out of district? Because we reimburse the receiving school district. So special ed, voc ed, any,
I think those are the only 2.
Those are the only 2.
what about our students that live in the city of Boston that attend METCO programs? Are we paying for the receiving school district?
I don't believe so.
No, okay. Okay, so that's, I'm happy to see an increase. I am always sort of concerned about this mismatch between the number of investigators. We have 1 in the city of Boston, and other outside districts have more. Can you talk about sort of some of the typical cases? For me, I am certainly concerned about a student who's experiencing homelessness, that we're not discharging them and that we remain, we protect them under the federal and state law that we should. But I often hear of cases of, this theft of resources is often with families that have assets, that have wealth, that own multiple properties, both inside and outside of the city. And is there sort of a profile that might fit, or several profiles that might fit, of the typical student or family that is skirting the system?
I don't think that there's any particular profile. I will say that I think a number of students start in our district, and parents have the resources and they decide to move and buy outside of and continue to attend our schools. And I don't know if it's a matter of educating them, that they think that this is perfectly okay. I can't answer that, but I think that that's more often the case. Most of the families or students that we investigate, the parents continue to own in the city and may have, a multi-family dwelling or even single-family homes. there are situations where families are living with other relatives. I mean, it really just runs, it really runs the gamut.
I have more, but I'll.
Okay. I want to acknowledge Councilor Tim McCarthy, who has also joined us. And so just to be clear, out of those numbers, do you have a breakdown of the number of students attending our test schools?
I don't, no.
If you can get that,
Sure.
that information, because I would love to understand if there is a difference in terms of that group of folks, one, from the reporting side, and two, from the 43 dismissal side. I think that would be a critical determining factor. I also think if you can get us information about a little bit more information about those out-of-district placements, because to my knowledge, out-of-district placements can cost up to a couple $100,000 a year, depending on who and where they're going. So I think there's from a actual savings perspective, with limited resources, I think there probably is a priority there in terms of that expenditure, and in addition to the fact that those dollars are actually going out of district, and so I think that there's a component there. So, what are we doing relative to students who are displaced? All right, so we have many, because of the economy in which we live in, there's many creative ways that people are living in Boston. What is the district doing, one, to make sure that those issues are incorporated into this policy, but also two, to assist those families in actually getting permanent housing?
So I'll just make a statement and turn it over to you that I think in my role, I have sort of a unique perspective in that I work with a lot of different city agencies and nonprofits. And so if there are families that come to my attention, I am more than happy and willing, and often do, make recommendations or connect people with different resources. We have, on a number of occasions, worked with the Office of Housing Stability under DND, and I've been able to, I know for a fact, place 3 families with them and get them housing. So that's something that I've been able to do. But Monica, why don't you comment on?
Yeah, so I think part of the reason why we are still really looking at the options that we are considering is because we want to make sure that in our shifts we don't negatively impact that particular set of families. So we are, as we're moving forward, we're looking at that, ensuring that we are not inequitably harming any set of families. In terms of the resources and how we're attending, one of the things is that families have the greatest connection with their school, not at the district level. And so we want to make sure often our school nurses are the first ones who are hearing from folks, as well as teachers. So we try to make sure that they have information. We have what we call an asset map that we launched in the last year or two, which is on our district website, and our partner BPS, where folks can look at what are resources by neighborhood. So if I am a school teacher or a school leader and I'm not sure what is in the neighborhood that that family is in, I can use that as one resource. We also have our Office of Homeless Education, our Homeless Education Resource Network, which, although they primarily are there to serve our homeless families, do support and provide information to any of our families who are experiencing any challenges. And so they are often able to direct families to and provide school supplies and resources to help direct them to programming within a community, to direct them to folks who are working on housing. I think one of the exciting things that we are in a process of doing because of the expected influx of families coming in from Puerto Rico is we have been working cross-departmentally and across the city, and bringing in organizations in the community who are serving families to think about how we collaboratively begin to think about supports for families. And part of our conversation is how do we deal with housing, because we know that there are challenges with housing in the city. And so that group is actually in a process of trying to identify a framework for what it would look like for a inter-agency sort of process of providing case management and support for our families who most need it.
And I think that's critical because, actually, you two came in the same time, right? No? You've been here longer? Okay.
Yeah.
When I became chair, there were 1,500 homeless students, and now there's 4,000. And so it is, I think, really a thought-provoking idea to begin to think about how the district, which has one of the deepest connections with families in the city of Boston, prevents homelessness, and is an early indicator, serves as a resource in terms of how we can think about some of these issues. And it's much cheaper to pay 1 month of back rent than to have somebody in the homelessness system. So I think there's something that we should begin to think about there.
I'd like to add also, too, that the Office of Social and Emotional Wellness received I believe it was a $1.2 million grant specifically targeted to this issue. And it allowed some of our schools with high need population to actually hire a homeless resource specialist. I don't know what those schools are.
But I think the biggest issue that we have, and I'm only going to speak in my district, is that the resources are tapped out. And so and I guess the question would be, would some of those dollars be even better used directing them towards those families? Because we get calls every day that are dealing with this. One component around the residency piece that I also wanted to note, we actually did, I was part of the committee that looked at residency relative to employees at Boston Public Schools. How many investigators do you have on that front?
We don't do employee investigations.
Who does that?
The city of Boston does.
Okay.
So we have the city through the Office of Human Resources.
Okay. And how often does the city explore its own as a department? Do you explore your own classifications? One of the issues that we had were that there were many people who were actually living outside of the city. Actually, some, I think there was one. It turned out to be a spouse, but there was someone in like Australia or something like that. But when it comes down to this issue, how has the Boston Public Schools explored its own employees relative to this issue of residency?
So I can speak to that because I've been working with our Director of Human Capital as well as our Legal Advisor's Office on this issue in conjunction with the city's Human Resource Department and I forget the commission.
The Residency Commission.
Yeah, the Residency Commission, and Frank Doyle. And we actually have a meeting tomorrow. But we have been refining, and working very, very closely with the city on this particular issue. And what complicates this issue for us and is the number of unions and the complexity of job titles and them not necessarily fitting into specific boxes. So we have spent the last 6 months going over everything with a fine-tooth comb. We have, I believe, classified our employees into 3 big buckets, and certainly there are some that are exempt, but those that are not exempt from the residency, we have been looking very closely. So we're pretty close to getting everything.
Because during the process, BPS did stand out as a department that actually did not have the information that we needed. And I also think as we have these conversations about enforcement of families that are in the district, I think it is very important that the Boston Public Schools look at itself in the mirror relative to its own enforcement of the employees that are supposed to be living in the city of Boston. Councilor McCarthy?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Welcome. Good to see you again, Monica. We're hanging out now. Carolyn, thanks very much. I was listening to Councilor Sabi George's questions in my office, so a lot of them has been covered. I'm not going to go over it, but I just want to say, you and Stevie Hickey do a great job with very little resources. And you, of course, are on speed dial in the McCarthy Council Chamber. So I want to thank you for really above and beyond everything that you're always so responsive, and we appreciate that. And I know you've got 1,000 things on your plate, so I really just came to say thanks, to be honest with you.
Very nice.
Thank you. I had one more question. So instead, and I guess I misstated how I'd like the breakout of those cases.
Sure.
Can you do them by school?
I could.
All right, so instead of just test
Sure.
schools, I think it would be really helpful.
I actually have numbers for up to year-to-date if you want those
I'd love
as
that,
well.
yeah, I think that would be
Awesome.
good too.
So you have, so the 108 was the prior year?
Yep.
What's the year-to-date this year?
This is, so this year, 17, 18, this is through December 5th, we have 38 cases, which I looked at the numbers at about this time last year, and we were pretty much on par, same number, around the same number. 10 students have been discharged thus far this year. 6 students were resolved with the finding that students were in fact residents of Boston. 4 students investigated were listed as homeless, and I know 3 of those 4 were siblings, as is often the case. And right now we have 18 active cases under investigation. And some of these take longer than others. I mean, there's no sort of average in terms of the investigatory process. And there are cases that sort of, we look and follow and track from one year to the next because there's suspicion, but we don't quite have all of the information. So a lot of this is in flux.
Do we do anything to help? So when you identify that those students are homeless, is it they're homeless and we just keep going, or is there any intervention component that occurred relative to that homeless population receiving any resources to help them?
So for our piece regarding the investigation, I mean, we close that case, but we always make sure to follow up with the school, and we generally leave it up to the school to support those families.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's the connection, and I think Monica just brought it up. So this is the disconnect in government, and I believe also in BPS right here. So you've identified a vulnerable population. You probably injected some trauma because they're getting investigated, and they're already homeless. And so I guess the question would be, with that information, which is really important, what are we doing to actually help that family? And I just think that there's a connection that should occur that would actually help in that regard, and also to assess what types of resources are needed for those families.
I did just want to add, when schools get information, generally they will then go back to the Homeless Education Resource Network office, because schools have, depending on what's available there, certain amount of supports they can provide. Certainly they're well equipped to provide the support around trauma, social emotional learning, and wellness, but they will often then refer families to that office for all of the other needs, including clothing, et cetera.
I got you, but where's that office house?
Actually in Boston Latin Academy.
It's Latin Academy, right? But it's a part of the central administration.
Yes.
Right, so the central administration has information, and we're pushing it back to the school to come back to the central administration. All I'm saying is that we have that information, and you have an extensive, and I'm assuming that the investigator does a really good job. So they have the the name and the family and all that other stuff. I just think that we got to cut the red tape, and these are vulnerable populations, and we've determined they live in Boston and they're homeless, right? So I just think that and actually, I guess that's the one other question I have. On the homelessness side of things, they don't actually have to live in the city, correct?
Correct. They're often not
Right,
placed.
so that's the other component there, right? Which is high, and just for the record, someone who is homeless in the state of Massachusetts is afforded the right to have their child go to the Boston Public Schools and have no break in their education, even if they are housed outside of the city of Boston, based on our current the federal and state guidance around those issues. Counselor?
Sure, I'd actually like, if you don't mind, respond to some of your concerns, because it's quite a bit of the work that I've been able to do over the last 23 and a half months or so. We have a pretty incredible working group that has connected a number of schools in the district that have a higher prevalence of students who are experiencing homelessness with housing supports as well as some community support. And that sort of very intensive look and analysis of the way that we are supporting families who are either experiencing homelessness or at risk of experiencing homelessness has been pretty incredible for me to be able to participate in that work. And I'd also share that the $1.2 million is actually not at all in the central office. It has all been sent out to the schools, and as part of sort of the weighted formula, the weighted student formula, similar to that, distributed to the schools so that it could support the work that's happening at the school level, because we know that that's where our students are and their families are often only connected to those school communities. So that work is pretty powerful and important, and I'm happy that we're doing it, and of course, always looking to do more of it. But back to some of the student residency questions that I have, particular to the policy and the work that you're doing around ensuring that our students in our schools are Boston kids. How much money, or how much have we invoiced for this theft of services? We can either go to date or by school year. How much has been invoiced and how much have we been successful in collecting?
I actually have to get you those numbers. I didn't have a chance to do that, but I will absolutely get you those numbers.
So do we invoice for theft of services, and how do we come up with that dollar amount?
We invoice students that we discharge. We determined that we were going to invoice from the time that we get the tip, because we looked at this with the Office of the Legal Advisor, and we had no other way of determining really when we should invoice. So we thought that we would invoice from the time that we get the tip.
So if a tip came in today, December 7th, but it might be documented that the student didn't live in the city since September 1st, but we'll just go from today forward.
Exactly.
Exactly. It's easier to defend legally, or?
What?
Is it easier to, do we do that because it's easier to defend legally?
Yes.
And then,
Pardon me. Oh, go ahead.
sorry, and then on the collection piece.
And
sorry,
on
I
the,
interrupted
so,
you.
and then the amount is determined, we use the per pupil expenditure that we reimburse to charter schools, which is per pupil expenditure. We back out transportation and special education costs. I know last year it was 86, I believe it was like 86.71 off the top of my, per diem. I don't know what the figure is off the top of my head
Per
this
year?
year. Yeah.
Per student,
Per day. So roughly $86 per day.
Oh, okay,
Like 86 and change.
okay.
And then we determine the number of days that they've been in attendance, and then we send the invoice.
I would be interested in what we've invoiced, what we've received back, because it's my understanding that we have actually received some payments from families that have been discharged. And I also know that one of the places where we run into difficulty is this proving the center of life for students. So a student can, in fact, live outside the city, but demonstrate that the center of their life is in the city and attend one of our schools.
I think the complexities of families has changed, and not every single case that we get is absolutely cut and dry. And we can try our level best to get as much information that, that we can. And frankly, we give the, we can discharge, and families have the right of appeal within 10 days. And when they appeal, they have to give it their best shot. So they have to provide as much compelling information and evidence as possible. And oftentimes, they're able to do so and demonstrate, like you said, that they're involved in the community and they spend a tremendous amount of time in that community. It gets very tricky.
Now, of the 37 cases that were resolved in last school year, of those are resolved, meaning the student either has determined legitimate residency or has determined legitimate residency that is the center of life bit. So they may not sleep in the city any night of the week, but they've determined that the center of their life is.
A lot of times, too, we're finding it's custodial. So one parent may live in the city and one parent may live in a neighboring town, and that child actually spends equivalent amounts of time in either residence. There's a lot of back and forth between residents with children.
One of the parts that frustrates me is when it's not a custodial issue, that it's grandparents or uncles and aunts, and it's simply the dropping off or the picking up spot that becomes really frustrating as a parent. I know when my boys play Little League, the Little League rules are so restrictive in who can play in which Little League program in the state of Massachusetts or in the city of Boston. And for my boys to play for their Little League program, they have to demonstrate that they either live in that district, which is outlined by boundaries, or go to school in that district, which is outlined by boundaries. And it's very simple, and I have to all but give a blood sample in order to prove that. And if I can't demonstrate it, my kid can't play baseball. And that's, baseball's a great sport, but for our kids in the city of Boston, and for me as a city councilor, it's my job to make sure that we're giving our city residents access to city schools. And when I understand that there is just this gray area that's so frustrating, it's upsetting to me, and it makes me really frustrated about this policy of that center of life business.
So I will say that's when we really rely on the observation piece of this, and we are doing, I think, a much better job at doing more observations over a longer period of time and taking our time with these, so they are a lot less able to punch holes in it. So we have discharged students where a parent was living outside and going to a relative's or some other house inside city boundaries and dropping that child off at the bus stop. So I think that's when the observations become super, super important.
I will say, I think one complicating factor is we have a lot of what we call kinship family structures, where you have grandparents. We have a number of grandparents who are raising their grandchildren, and very often without custodialship at all. And they're feeding them, they're living with them, they're doing everything, but mom is still the one who comes in and does stuff in welcome services, but they're residing with the grandparents. So I think one of the things that we have to do is help families understand kind of the I don't want to say the bureaucracy, but the pieces, the policy pieces and implications for the family and how that impacts their family structures, right? So they're trying to structure themselves in a way that supports that unit. And then there are the realities of the system and how we're trying to work. And I speak from experience. My mother and father raised one of my nieces and nephews, and they had custody of one and not the other. And so they were residents. And so this is, I think, one of the things we're going to have to figure out is how do we do that work.
My challenge is the family that lives outside the city. Both parents have professional jobs, multiple cars registered to the house outside the city, yet every morning that kid gets dropped off at a Boston address.
Yeah.
And then goes off to any one of our schools, be it an exam school or not an exam school, a special ed program, a K0 or K1 seat that's so valuable. And then at the end of the day, they return to the grandparents' home, the parent picks them up, and they drive off back to the suburbs.
Yeah.
And sort of, they get the best of both worlds. And I think, and that's where it comes down to. It's so often, it's so frustrating when so often it's families of wealth or of means that can pick and choose. So they move off to the suburbs and, the suburban school is not all it's cracked up to be, but my kid got into Latin school or Latin Academy, the O'Brien, or into this advanced work classroom or this great K0, this full-time kindergarten program, or that's, my kid is upset that they're leaving their friends. So, well, grandma and grandpa still live in the city. We can make it work because we have means. And that's incredibly frustrating to watch, especially as us, our responsibility to mind the purse strings and protect the interests of our residents. That's the end of it for me. Thank you.
I think it's, and just to continue on with that, I think it also is a credit to much of the great work that the Boston Public Schools is doing. And I think we need to look at it in that regard also, that these are highly sought after seats. And people are willing to, by hook or crook, do whatever they think they need to do to get folks in. So I think there's as the BPS gets hit so often, there are people who are willing to contort themselves, their lives, their transportation to get their children into these classrooms. So I just think that we need to put that component also in perspective as other organizations bring up waiting lists and the like. Well, we have the same, and this actually shows that. How long does a case stay unresolved?
I don't really have an answer.
Well, I'm just saying, is there a, so there must be a cutoff that says this case gets classified in the parking lot over here, right? How do you?
Unless, so we work closely with the school, and unless we, there are times when we'll get additional information, and there are just some of those cases that sort of rise to the top where we know we have a high suspicion that we're being gamed. And we'll follow those, but I can't give you sort of a hard and fast time frame. But we do follow, we follow those cases, particularly when there are multiple siblings, or we see other siblings coming in. So we watch them closely.
So how many carryovers from last year?
So I would say the 22 cases that went unresolved, I'm not sure if those are those. I could find out.
Okay.
Carryovers. I don't have that.
Okay. I'd like that, because just, from what you were just saying, I guess it would be interesting to hear how many of those are carryovers, and then how many of those actually are determined to be improperly in the schools. And when there's an appeal, you said there's a 10-day appeal process. Who does the appeal go to, and who adjudicates that?
So we have a residency review committee. We meet weekly, and we review cases, and it's a cross-section of people from the district. When a family appeals, they have 10 days to do so. They put it in writing, and they provide information, more information to prove residency. It goes again before the Residency Review Committee. It is reviewed, that decision is reviewed by the Chief of Staff as well, and then the final determination is made.
And are there any times in which BPS meets with the city residency board in order to determine best practices, standard operating procedures? Because I think there's something that could be gained by in the medical field, they do a MMR, and they would actually look back at a
Right.
case and have people from different specialties come back and look at it. Is there any kind of cross-pollination between what happens on the city side as well as Boston Public Schools?
So we haven't convened any working group meetings, but I've been in touch with them and have regular conversations with them.
I think that, and I would suggest that, you're doing essentially the same work. And I think it would be really interesting to look at the manner in which the work is done from both fronts, any successes, baseline standard operating procedures that you have, best practices across the board. I think that would make a lot of sense in order to become better and more nimble at this, and considering you're actually doing the same work.
I'm all set. Thank you. I really appreciate your time today, and thank you, Chair, for getting this meeting done.
And this is and I think with limited resources, and we've seen that more and more lately, that our schools are not funded at the level that they should be. They're underfunded. And to have resources walking out the door, and I think to Councilor Asabi George's, listen, if you're living in a very affluent neighborhood outside the city of Boston and you're buzzing in, dropping folks off, I think that's one of the things that that most hurts us. I think the other component is we know that we live in a city of Boston that is based on the cost of living here, pushing a lot of folks out, and actually meaning that being domiciled or living at some place means something totally different today than it did 30 years ago. It looks different. The types of sharing that have to go on right now to be able to stay in this city it's just really stretching our imagination relative to that. I think it's incumbent upon us not only to chronicle this information and just get the data. We're dealing with people. And I think it's really critical that we actually take that data and use it, operationalize it, and help the people who are still in need. And also, proactively, how do we get ahead of this? Because so there are people who, yes, are gaming the system and they have a bunch of dough. There's a bunch of other folks who have to think about how they keep their children in schools based on their issues relative to socioeconomic status, class, and whether or not they're considered homeless based on the state definition. So I think there's a huge opportunity with a vulnerable population here to help move the dial in this space. And we will now ask for public testimony. Are there any individuals who would like to testify? If you could identify yourself. You know what? Yeah. Those are new, so we're gonna see if they work today. If you can identify yourself for the record, I know this is the first time you've been at the council.
My name's Eileen Boyle. I am actually one of the members under Save Our City for the Residency Compliance
can we-
Commission.
It's on, but.
Okay. Can you lean in a little bit?
Hello?
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, that's way
Okay.
too low. My name is Eileen Boyle. I am one of the members of the Residency Compliance Commission under the Save Our City membership. And I just want to state that I know this has been a long, painful issue, especially as a parent of 3 sons, navigating through the public school system. and seeing a father 20 years ago in West Roxbury literally cry because he found out that his daughter did not get into the exam schools and then found out there were several seats stolen by people outside the city. It was probably a pinnacle moment for me 20 years ago. I know Carolyn is working extremely hard on this issue, and I appreciate everything she's doing along with Councilor Asabi George. I guess I just have a couple of questions. The review board that's with the public school, I hope they're all residents of Boston, number one. I think there's been a disconnect with employment in the public school because too many of them are not living in the city because they, for whatever reason, are under that statute under the state as a teacher. So in the past, I've had sad conversations with administration from the BPS where they really didn't want to look at residency, student residency, because they just wanted to keep the numbers up for federal funding or state funding. And also, I wanted to know, I came in a little late, but I wanted to know if there is any serious investigation for students who are applying or have been accepted into BPS who have documentation from schools outside of the city. You know, is there a little more digging that goes on with those students? That was one of the questions I want to ask
So
Carolyn too.
I can answer
Yeah.
that last question. I don't know what your other question is, but, so, right now, we have the individual who oversees all of the testing in the welcome centers. She puts together a list for the residency investigator of all students who have taken the test, who go to school out of district, whether that be private, parochial, or other schools. So we get that list in advance of exam school notifications, and so that, we're just sort of getting that list right now. So we absolutely do a much deeper dive on those, because it becomes more difficult once we give the invitation. If we can get ahead of the game, which we've gotten much better at, and investigating before, we will not invite them into school. So yes, we do that. And I don't know what your other question was.
My other question is, what definition of residency is the BPS going by? Because under the city, it's where you lay your head at least 4 nights out of the week, where you sleep, where your clothes are, where your artifacts are. And this, I think in the case that the Councilor Asabi George is talking about, where, where their center of life is.
Right.
Unfortunately, I think the city, the BPS probably wasn't prepared for a snazzy lawyer to argue that case. But that definition alone should state, and when they filled out the application, and who has guardian. It should go by guardianship and where that child is lying their head down at the end of the night.
So I can't speak too in-depth about that. I know I've had conversations with our chief legal counsel about that particular definition. And if I'm not mistaken, it's part of some case law, but I can't speak too fully on that.
Eileen,
But we've had conversations about it, and there is precedent, whether it's precedent in Boston or Massachusetts, that I cannot answer, but I know that it is a precedent.
if you can just do me a favor, if you can direct it to
Sure.
your question to the
Sorry.
chair, and then I can
Okay.
play Tom
All right.
Brady and
Sorry,
direct it
Councilor.
back out.
Sorry.
So my final question is, I didn't hear any talk about this. I know we're predominantly just talking about the BPS, but I'm just curious about the charter schools, because I know a lot of students outside the city are attending the charter schools inside the city. So, is there any conversation about that? And I know that there's federal funding, but I just see you know, in funding, like, where does the money come? I think there's city money that also sponsors the charter schools too, correct? Am I wrong?
So we could get some, so one, the charters, actually, this is a little bit complicated, right? Because the dollars follow the student, and those schools are actually physically in the city of Boston. I believe that charters are actually allowed to, and there are many charters in Boston that actually are able to field students from multiple municipalities. I think one of the things that you brought up earlier is critical. We have it in medical records now, is some type of unique identifier, right? And so I think the easiest way to figure this stuff out is if there is, and I don't know that, and if you can clarify on the BPS side, is there a unique identifier that says, I'm Tito Jackson, I was born on April 11th, and these are, and is it at the state level? Because the interesting piece would be if we had a unique identifier, this would actually absolutely be very easy, which would state, okay, Tito is applying for Boston Latin School, but he's currently a student at Brookline High School. Or Brookline Elementary School or middle school, right? So if we had some, do we have, when I take a test for MCAS or PARC, is there something attached to my name as a unique identifier as who I am?
Every student has a state ID that, that we use.
So I guess my question, especially for this test school component, right, is if that student, and I don't know what type of reciprocity you have with another town, but out of all of the students this is actually probably pretty easy, right? Out of all of those students who sign up for the ISEE, right? Can you bounce that list off of that state list that determines whether, because that's not too hard, right?
Well,
So
they have to
So
give their school records anyway.
Yeah, so we actually are able to identify, so I think what Carolyn was talking about earlier, there are two pieces. The family has to first come in and if they're going to take the test with the Boston Public Schools, prior to doing that, they have to verify that they are a Boston residency, meeting the same requirements as if they were coming in for registration. Now, if they're taking the test with ERB, so do a private testing site, obviously that's not required, but before they can actually be extended a offer, they would have to come. They still have to come do that. So even if they go to ERB, they may be able to sit for the test, but they still have to verify residency by the same deadline as any family who is coming to sit with BPS. So we have a deadline for that. I think the additional step that we've been trying to take is even though they've been able to verify residency, if they are not attending a school in the Boston area, we are still sharing that information with this review committee so that they can do an additional check, if you will, just to verify that what they've been able to produce in paper is true in actuality.
Okey doke.
I was going to add a comment. My head cold is blocked it out, sorry.
Oh, you didn't tell me about that. I would have sat over
I
there.
just want to comment, I'm glad this hearing is taking place, and I hope to further work with the BPS on both employee and student situations, and I thank you for the work that you're doing, okay?
My name is Denise Williams-Harris. I'm also on the residency compliance for the city and also with Save Our City. I have one question. You brought up that you do investigating. And part of it also, when you find a student or the family does not live in the city, they've been in the school system, and I assume you have a hearing. Am I not right? You have a hearing?
My understanding is there are times that there are hearings and other
Right.
times there aren't.
So at the end of the process, and the student, I gather, has to leave the public school, Boston public school system, is there a monetary amount that the family has to pay?
Yeah,
Because
so
I
we
do
did
know in other cities,
during
they
the course
make
of the
them.
hearing, we discussed invoicing and the dollar amount, which is about $86 a day,
Okay,
once a student's been,
so the family has to pay that amount.
yes, they're billed, and we're going to get that data.
Okay, so is that information, is that communicated with, because I'm also, I would like to know about that. I think if they're doing investigative process and the residency compliance, ourselves are doing investigative, can't we work together on this? Or, because there seems like there's a lack of communication. And also, there was said something about there is only one investigator. Is this investigator full-time, part-time? What is the process? How long does it take him and her to do his or her? How long does it take? Is it a limited amount of time that they do this investigation? And also, are the people that are on this process of their residency, are they, like Ms. Boyle said, are they also are they employees? Are they parents? Who selects these people? That's what I'm saying.
Yep, and I would also note, and I think Councilor Sabi George brought it up earlier, we are understaffed when it comes to this. And it's exponentially higher if you really think about it, because there's about 17,000 city employees, and there are a couple of investigators, I believe, in that, or
We have one.
We have one, but that's a 1 to 17,000 ratio versus a 1 to 58,000 ratio, which I think is, and in addition, at the city level, we're looking at where that one individual lives, not where their parents live.
Right.
Right, so I think it makes it, you are gravely under-resourced when it comes to actually doing this work. Do you want to respond to any of the aforementioned questions?
I kind of forgot.
I think that most of the questions that were asked, I think, is information that we're waiting for, so I'd be happy to share that with you, Denise, once I receive it.
Any closing remarks?
No, I think we're very committed to making sure that Boston Public Schools serves Boston residents, and that in the process we are attending to this issue of equity and not harming historically marginalized families. So we look forward to bringing to you in the spring the outcomes of our process of thinking about the options that we like to put in place, and to working with the Boston community as we implement them.
Carolyn, any closing remarks?
We take this very, very seriously, and both employee and student residency, and I think that what Monica said, just looking how we can tighten the process without doing irreparable harm to families, I certainly look forward to those conversations.
Councilor Sabi George?
I'm very good. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And I also note, and I just want to end on what Monica ended on. This also has to be looked through an equity lens. It is the rules and process of the school committee to look at everything through the opportunity and achievement gap. And in many of the folks that we're speaking about, these are marginalized populations and some of the poorest people in the city of Boston, and just simply trying to do the best that they can to hold on. And I think we need to be connecting the need with the resources that are out there. If the resources don't exist, it's incumbent upon the Boston City Council, Mayor's Office, and the Boston Public Schools to provide the resources in order to have the outcomes that we need. Thank you so much, and this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.